Okay, hello everyone. Good morning. It's nice to see so many people, and I hope you'll all be there at the end of the session. We've got a great session. So we have 4 wonderful women from different parts of the world, all of them writers, and we're going to talk about, we're going to talk beyond the veil, talk about Muslim women in the world. Let me just briefly introduce our panelists, and then they're going to talk about themselves a little bit, so they will give you a little more of an introduction. Bejan Matur is from Turkey. She's a poet, and she's one of the best-known poets in Turkey. Next to her, Nadifa Mohamad is from Somalia, lives in England, is the author of 2 novels, and is a well-known writer. Next to her is Fariba Hachtroudi, who is from Iran originally, lives in France, writes fiction and non-fiction, has 14 books to her credit. And next to her is Shireen Feki, who's from Egypt and who lives in England, who is half Egyptian, and who has recently written a much talked about non-fiction book of her account of 5 years of work in the Arab world called Sex and the Citadel. So we've got what we're actually missing, as these women pointed out to me in the Author's Lounge, is a Muslim voice from India. And unfortunately, there is a rather wonderful panel going on simultaneously at this time, which has one of the really well-known Muslim women writers from India called Salma, who is also secretly, or who was secretly and now is not so secretly, an erotic poet and a novelist and a politician. And it would have been great to have her on this panel with us, but she's here in spirit. So I'm going to ask each of these women who have written about the experience of traveling in the Muslim world, written about Islam and women, written about the veil, and chosen different forms of writing. I'm going to ask each of them to briefly describe to you their journey into this writing. The 3 of them there, Shireen, Fariba, and Nadifa, have actually journeyed back into their countries, secretly or otherwise, and have written about them. And you live in Turkey, so journeying back is not really a question, but you're writing from within that. So can I ask you, Shireen, to start a little bit by telling us a little bit about yourself, your journey?
Absolutely. So as Urvashi mentioned, I've spent the past 5 years traveling across the Arab region, talking to people about sex, what they do, what they don't, and what they think and why. Now I know, depending on your perspective, this might sound like a dream job, or possibly a highly dubious occupation.
And she hasn't told you that she started with taking sex toys and showing them around.
Sorry, this is like telling the butler did it. I mean, where do we go from here? And I appreciate that sex is an unusual lens with which to look at any society, but the reason I chose sex, and I chose to look at the Arab region, was both personal and professional. On the personal front, as Urvashi mentioned, I am half Egyptian, I am Muslim, my family live in Egypt, but I was brought up in Canada, as you can hear from my accent, very far from my Arab roots. And I never thought much about my Arab heritage until September 11th. And the tragic events of that day really prompted me to want to know more about where I came from. And so I reoriented my career to the Middle East. The fact that I chose sex as my lens through which to look at Arab societies comes from my background, my professional background as an immunologist, but also as a journalist with The Economist magazine for many years. My responsibility, part of it was writing about the global HIV/AIDS epidemic. I became interested in the situation around HIV in the Arab world. Now, many people think we don't have HIV in the Arab region, but of course we do. There are only 2 parts of the world now where HIV is still on the rise, and the Middle East and North Africa is one of them. If you want to understand HIV, you need to look at sex. And the taboos around sex are a huge obstacle to confronting this epidemic. So in the Arab region, it's very hard to just sit down with someone and say, hey, I want to talk about sex. At least not if you're not asking to be paid for it. But if you wear the white coat of public health, it gives you a respectability, and so it enabled me to get in the door and talk to people, men and women, heterosexual, homosexual, transgendered, rich, poor, educated, uneducated, liberal, conservative, the whole range of society. And what I discovered when I got in the door and I took off my white coat of public health, then I could really start talking about sexuality. And as Urvashi herself has written extensively, sexuality is a very, very rich way in which to look at a society. In a sense, I call it a lens, because what happens inside the bedroom is intimately connected to what happens outside the bedroom, in politics and economics and religion and tradition. So I use sex as my lens, and as I say in my book, if you really want to know a people in the Arab region, or indeed here in India, you start by looking inside their bedrooms. And that's what I did.
It's what they're doing more and more right now, actually.
But Fariba, that's not how you started. You actually made a different kind of journey.
Yes, in fact, I went, it's funny because my life, there is a similarity. I've been sent to France when I was 12, and in fact, I was brought up in a family of enlightened men and women, and especially totally secular, even though very respectful towards religion, but secular, that the secularity we just have in France, which is laïcité, which is the separation totally between religion and politics, but respect for other believers or non-believers. That is very particular. And I used to dare saying in Iran that I am atheist or agnostic, because my father taught us you are totally free. Anyhow, I was sent to France, and then when the revolution arose, I had finished my PhD in archaeology. I had nothing to do with writing or journalism, and I went to journalism in the beginning to try to say what's going on in my country, but also, as she said, to find out what has happened to my country. Because really, when I saw this fanatism on the TV, I used to say I lived the revolution in France through the channel of the TV. My father died 2 years before the revolution. He was a very great man, very big scientist and a philosopher, etc. And I was asking, as I talk all the time with my father, he's somewhere here, even now, I think. Anyhow, even though that I'm agnostic, you see the contradiction between human mind, but doesn't matter. Okay. But I was asking him, what's going on? What's going on in this country? And in fact, I was brought up in a very, very particular family. My grandfather was a great religious man, but who really fight for the constitution in Iran, for the separation, for a kind of laicity and secularity in Iran. Then I really tried to find out what was going on in my country from France. But after 3 years that I wrote about Iran, I thought I cannot write about a country that I'm not in. Then, like a fool woman, really, when people, they tell me you have been very courageous, very honestly they tell them, and it's really honest, I was very unconscious. I went through the border, through Balochistan and Afghanistan. Through the border, I went back to Iran to find out what was going on, and that has changed my whole life. In fact, the real question was to ask myself whether, like a lot of other compatriots, I will forget this country for a while. I live in France. I was very well off in France. I write in French. I am assimilated, as the French they used to say. But in fact, when I went back to Iran, I find out that deeply there is a link between this country and I. And especially when I saw what's going on towards women, I thought, I have to fight. I really fought, and still I continue to fight. And I think till the end of my life, I will fight. But anyhow, to promote a little bit of freedom for my country. And I started by journalism. When I came back, I wrote about what I've seen. And in fact, at the very moment I went back to Iran, I saw what she said, that a sexuality and the power that men wants to have over women is one of the biggest problem of our century. When my father, one of his latest conferences in the French embassy on the 14th of July was about the Bastille, the big prison in France. The Bastille of the 21st century will be to free women around the world. Then I had a feminist behind me to push me as an individual to do whatsoever I wanted, be free in my body. And when I went back to Iran, it's why what I wanted to say, in the 85, 86 started the phenomenon of prostitution of women. That is one of the biggest problems actually in Iran. And the prostitution because of the economic problem that was, we were under the war, we were under a terrible situation, etc., etc. Then I came back, I wrote about my journey, what I've seen, and I said, in fact, I should do something. And I started journalism, little by little, documents. And when my mother died in a very weird and terrible way, in the beginning I thought, I mean, she was killed, but I thought that was a political reason, which wasn't. Again, it was totally something else, but again, had to do with what was going on in the country. It was about her money and so forth. I went to novel because I thought what I have to write is not just about my mother. In the beginning, I wrote a very small book. I gave it to the publisher, Le Seuil. They told me, listen, and I called it A Violent Death. It was titled remind the very La Mort Douce, a very soft death of Simone de Beauvoir. And they told me, try to make a novel. You're not well known. Then a documentary, I mean, a testimony. Yeah, I have to be.
Because then I want to come to the others.
Sure. Then I went to novels, but I am switching between novels and essay whenever I have to do really things. My two latest books, which comes back to sexuality, and I've worked a lot about sexuality in Iran and what's going on beyond the veil and beyond this, what they try to really impose on people. There is a big part of sexuality among our leaders and among free sexuality and also deviation of sexuality. That is two different things. Maybe we can talk together. And I wrote a poetry book recently, and in fact I wrote some erotic poetry, and the drawing, which are beautiful, with one of my friends, it's very erotic. And I'm going to send one of these copies.
Good thing you can't see them from where you are.
But in fact, we are going to make a big exhibition to talk about that, because that is something that we should really talk now within the Muslim world. When we are not free about our body, we can't be free in our mind. I finished then, and then we'll continue.
Yes, thank you. Nadifa, I'd like you to talk a little about your work. You too have written about your father, like
I have.
Shireen.
I wrote about Muslim men before I started writing about Muslim women.
Yeah. What is it with you women? You write about Muslim men and then you start writing about women.
Who knows? Who knows? But my father's story was so unusual. I thought he was born into a nomadic family in the 1920s, and then in the first 25 years of his life, he was a street boy, a child soldier for the Italian fascists in East Africa, a farmer, a successful farmer until he was wiped out by locusts, a wandering musician. He was arrested in Egypt as a spy, and eventually became a sailor.
Sailor, yeah, that's amazing.
So it's an interesting story.
It is, very much.
I decided to write about it. And my mother is kind of the polar opposite. She's a very reserved figure. She lived most of her life in Somalia until she was brought very unhappily to the UK in the 1980s. So the female story was much harder for me to understand. It was much slipperier. And my grandmother, who was a hugely important figure in my father's life, she was the one who gave him the money that he used to become a sailor. And when we left Somalia in the 1980s, this wonderfully powerful woman who'd got married 6 times and was now making a living as a fortune teller and had this orchard in the back of our house, she was left paralyzed by a car accident. And when the war broke out, she was left behind. Everyone fled for their lives in the first few hours of the war. So she was just sitting there in bed waiting for a bomb to come through the ceiling. So that's at the heart of my second novel, The Orchard of Lost Souls. And I think Somalia in the last 20 years since the war, the role of women has completely changed. They've become much more active. You know, the economy is pretty dependent on Somali women's small earnings as market stall holders or selling cards, things like that. But, okay, and slower, okay. Well, even though they're economically important, Somali women are not politically important. And when they tried to set up a political party recently in Somaliland, which is the part of Somalia that I'm from, it didn't happen. It didn't take off at all, which is surprising because the clan structure, which has caused so much damage to Somalia, women don't benefit from it. You're part of the clan that you're born into, then your children are part of the clan that your husband belongs to. So you're stuck between them. And women really did bear the brunt of that during the Civil War, of having these mixed loyalties, these divided loyalties. So it's taken me a long time to understand what it means, or even to begin to understand what it means to be a woman in Somalia. And the books that I'm writing are trying to actually get on. The third book I will start writing soon is also going to return to that theme.
Okay, and your poetry?
Thank you. I come from Turkey, but I am from...
Louder.
I'm from Turkey,
It's
but...
not working.
No,
It's not working. The mics are not working.
maybe you just need to hold it. Hold it here and see.
Can you hear now?
No.
So the mic's not working.
The audience is very
It's all right, we'll manage.
The audience is very
Testing times. All right, one mic is working. Let us share in the spirit.
Can you hear now? Okay.
Is yours
Better.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Turkey, but I'm from Kurdish origin and Alevite as well. That's why I come from a completely different identity from the Turkish, any Turkish citizen. And I grew in a society which is Alevite. Let me say something about my culture. Some says we are not Muslim. We are out of Islam world. Some say we are part of Islam. This is a big discussion in our belief. And it's a kind of syncretic, heretic culture. It has many elements, like from shamanism, from Zarathustrian, even from Buddhism, we have some elements in our ritual. We don't have mosque, we don't go to, we don't fast, we don't, pray. Our ritual is more musical, and women and men are always together. It was a actually very peaceful and how do you say, a very natural culture which has a very strong tie with universe or cosmos. My poetry comes from that. And I write in Turkish. I cannot write in Kurdish in my own language because we don't have a right to have an education in Kurdish, which is still a big problem in our country. And when people say our country is a country of contradiction, sometimes they exaggerate. But Turkey is really a country of contradictions. We are stuck between West and East, and between secularism and Islam, and many other contradictions. And I grew up to witness all of these kind of different problems. And for me to, of course my poetry started when I was in prison, when I was 18 years old, studying law in Ankara, in capital city of Turkey. Just being a Kurd was enough to be in prison. For 1 year, I was there. And then poetry was a kind of way to console myself, console my soul, and cure myself. It was a kind of therapy to write. But the poetry I write is more connected to our, the question of our being, and it's somehow mystic, and it has many different elements, as I told about my culture. And there is a God and Allah always, but I'm not religious at all. I don't know how, somehow God or Allah came into my poetry. This is a big problem. Because when in Arabic or in Arab world, any country, when I am invited for the festivals, and when they want to translate my poetry, there is always problem I have to solve. And they said, as a woman, as an individual, you cannot Allah in your line or poetry in that way. You have to hide it. I had 2 years ago in Qatar, in Doha, they published a book called Reflection on Islamic Art. And they invited some people from the different countries, like Zizek, Shireen and Eric Hobsbawm, and one of them was me from Turkey. They asked me to visit the Museum of Islamic Art and choose a piece and write a poem about that piece. And I went there and I chose an astrolabe, and which was invented in 9th century and by Al-Hijabi. And I wrote a long poem. It was 25, yeah. And then when it comes to translate into Arabic to publish, and they sent me a letter and they said, we cannot publish that because you are using Allah in very direct way as is someone you can talk to. And that was a big problem, and they even wanted me to anyway, in Turkish version, in English version, and in Arabic version, we had 3 different steps, and for each of them, I have to bargain with them, and to say, yes, as an individual, as a poet, I can write whatever I feel and whatever I think, and the religion is a way to understand man. It's the way to understand universe or cosmos for me. And that's why at the end, of course, I won the fight, the battle. Still I'm witnessing this kind of problems. But will there be a second session or maybe?
If we have time, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, maybe I can say later on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll come back to this. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, so I have a couple of questions to put to all of you. The first of these is each of you comes from or belongs to a country that is at the heart of much that is going on in the world today, whether it's Turkey or it's Somalia or it's Iran or it's Egypt. I mean, you could not come from countries which are much more involved in what's going on in the world of grand politics today. Each of you chooses to write somewhat away from that sort of grand political writing, and much of your writing focuses on women, though not necessarily all of it, but much of it focuses on women. And in some ways, you're not the stereotypical Islamic women, which is the image that represents, which is not necessarily the truth, but it's the image that is generally chosen to represent Islamic women. And you negotiate a space with this grand narrative, but you're also actually in some ways representing what's happening in the minutiae of women's lives. How do you negotiate these two spaces? How do you think your writing, the kind of writing that you do, can or should and does inflect the larger narrative, if it does at all? And is that your intention at all, or do you want to just focus on the small stories? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Nadifa, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. It's interesting. I was thinking a lot about
Can you hear? Yeah.
what the female body means to Somali women. Much of what non-Somalis read about when it comes to Somali women is female genital mutilation. If not, it'd be maybe the hijab or something outrageous being done to women's bodies. So FGM is not understood by Somali women the way it's understood by other people. It's contested, but it's also part of everyday life. So you don't reflect on it every day thinking, oh my God, what has been done to me? So I wanted to think about their bodies, but because they're always being talked about as bodies, I wanted to look more on their souls and their minds. So my second book is focused on their psychology. There's a country falling apart all around them, but really what's at the heart of their thoughts is loneliness. They're just lonely. All of the characters in the book are lonely. The widow has lost her children, she's lost her husband, so there's no role for her anymore. She's not fulfilled the purpose she was born for. The soldier is trying to work out a new form of femininity. You know, she's been offered all of these things, this new equality according to the dictatorship, but it's not working out that way. And then there's this little girl who belongs to no one, an orphan living on the streets, and her body is just a tool for people. Something to be, punished if she does something wrong, something to be utilized to make some kind of profit out of. So they are a body, but all of the stuff that's going on inside is what's often overlooked by people outside of them.
So that's what you're drawing attention to.
Yes.
Bejan, would you want to talk a little about how you negotiate? I mean, you write in Turkish, you are a Kurd.
Yeah.
You speak on about Turkish women. How do you actually?
Beside poetry, I write a prose book, and I had a daily column at the newspaper. Now I quit, but I will start very soon again. And usually I write about minority rights, about women, and Kurdish issue, and other problems in Turkey, what we have. And talking about women, it's really when I go to the festivals and try to join the panels, I always witness that all the women writers from Eastern world or from Muslim world are trying to talk about all those stereotypes and trying to defend themselves that we are not that really, we are some other things. And this is almost in every panel discussion I see. And there are stereotypes. There are many, from outside of our world, there are something is told being about us, about our culture or identity. When I look at the Turkish society, which is secular officially secular since 80 years, they are very proud that Mustafa Kemal, the national leader, gave them the rights to vote and other things. But all those rights were given from the above, from somewhere else. But in Kurdish society, as I see these days, we have a party called BDP in Parliament House, which is a Kurdish origin party, and they fight for their own rights. And its character is very secular, and they have been very successful. When I see them and their politics, and there is women are equal than men and even stronger. Men are, I had a book it's about the PKK guerrillas who are in mountains still fighting with Turkish army. When I went there to the mountain to do some interview with them, and one of the commander, he told me, he says, we are suffering from the women. They are stronger than us. How happened that? How comes? I try to understand this question. A Middle Eastern society, an oppressed society, a Muslim society, but women are stronger than men now.
But how did he mean? In what way stronger?
I mean, they are in every step of politics. They represent all the value of being a woman in their politics, daily politics, in every part of the life, and all institutions, in Parliament House, even in mountain, in everywhere, you can see women. They are visible, they are strong, and they have right to talk about themselves and defend themselves in a very feminist way. This is something, it's very new for our society, but it happened. When I try to understand how it's happened, I see that, our culture, there is kind of matriarchal elements, and still it's remain. And it's grow on this stage, on these roots, because when you look at all this traditional society, you can see women power. When I try to understand any society, first I look at the women. Then you can judge a society, if they are a modern society or secular or not. This is a great standard for me, a very strong standard. Look at the women first. That's why in Turkey, we are still struggling, and there are many problems, but I think as a Kurds or Alevite women, we succeed already. Thank you.
In India, we have a phrase, when somebody says something that you really like, you say to them, "Aapke muh mein ghee shakkar," meaning, may your mouth be filled up with butter and sugar, which is not a very good thing, but it assumes a positive thing. So I was going to say that to you. But, thank you, because what both of you have pointed to is that there is something very different going on beyond the veil. That when you actually look beyond that, the reality of women is much more complex and
contradictory.
And contradictory, yes. And it gives you, as Bejan has said, insights into understanding particular societies. Shireen, what did you find when you went into your research and looked beyond the veil? And you also, at some point, I think you had talked about not only what women, the women you met, what they were thinking, but also what they were writing.
Absolutely. I have to say that in the course of my research, I talked to both men and women, but it's mainly women's voices who feature in the book, because quite frankly, they had much more interesting things to say about sex, in large part because the burden, the biological, physiological consequences of sexuality and reproduction fall heavily on women, but also the regulation, the double standards, the element of control that is exercised on the individual over the family, and also by the state on the individual. This falls very heavily on women. I just wanted to pick up on the point about your very interesting question about the political and how perhaps a more personal, up close and personal look may connect to that. I firmly believe in the course of doing my research that the sexual and the political are intimate bedfellows, and that if we do not achieve justice and freedom and dignity and equality and privacy in our private lives, and in particular in our sexual lives, we're not going to achieve it in the public space.
Sure, yeah.
And certainly when I was down in Tahrir Square, for example, in the midst of the protests, talking to young sort of revolutionaries, certainly as many of the young women I interviewed really understood that connection at a really deep, visceral level. But it was also interesting, I talked to many young men who were in the streets, fighting and dying for what they saw as the democratic ideal. But when I asked them if this would include sexual freedom, for example, they were absolutely horrified. I said, no, 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 this is not the sort of democracy that we are looking for. But it's very interesting if one looks at the long history of sexuality and sexual writing in the Arab region. Certainly, there was a time when we, as Arabs, were famous for our openness. And in fact, 1,001 Nights, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, quite frankly. And I have to tell you that there is nothing in The Joy of Sex or Cosmopolitan, or dare I say it, even in 50 Shades of Grey, that they were not writing about in the Arab world 1,000 years ago. And what's interesting is that when the Arabs were at the zenith of their political power, they had an ease in their sexual skin. So you fast forward now to Egypt, and we've had 6 decades of political repression. And we have seen, in large part as a response to that, a rise of Islamic fundamentalism. And with that Islamic fundamentalism has come a very narrow discourse around sex. That almost everything is haram, it's forbidden, it's aib, it's shameful. The body of a woman must be covered. There are these very, very tight restrictions. And what's interesting is that it's an incredibly narrow interpretation of Islam. And if you go back to the great works of Arabic erotica, and even back to the sayings of the Prophet Mohamad, peace be upon him, there was a much more open attitude. And what I'm arguing, and what many people in my book, certainly some of the activists who are pushing at the boundaries, whether it's trying to find a place for unwed mothers or getting sexuality education into schools, or even the incendiary topic of LGBT or homosexual rights, they see that connection between the political and the personal, and also the importance of opening up the discourse in religion, and that Islam is not black and white, and certainly on many aspects of sex we have more flexibility than is acknowledged. But on the subject of women writing about sex, certainly we have a long tradition, and particularly in the second half of the 20th century and 21st century, of famous women writers across the Arab world, even from...
An Islamic world.
Exactly, but
Iran is an Arab world, and you have fantastic literature about
absolutely.
it.
But for my focus is on the Arab region, and even from such ostensibly conservative climates as Saudi Arabia. And what's interesting is these women are writing often very explicitly about sex within the context of Arabic, but there is always a reticence. There is a sort of self-censorship that comes in. There is also a state censorship in many cases. But many of the women writers I have spoken with also feel much more comfortable writing in fiction than nonfiction. It gives them a sort of freedom to explore if they can detach themselves. But certainly there are many, many women who are looking very deeply at these issues. And I would say that actually, funnily enough, the great unknown in the Arab region is what's happening with men. We know a lot about women when it comes to sex, but very little about what men want. I suspect that might be a universal phenomenon.
Okay, Fariba. One of the questions that I wanted to put to you was in connection with what the others have been talking about. There is, as Shireen is saying, there's a lot of writing and a lot of creative expression, let's say, which could take the form of writing, or which could take the form of art, or which can take the form of resistance theatre.
Or in the internet now as well, which is
or the internet, that's right.
For this sort of expression.
And Iran is particularly known for the sort of resistance writing within that atmosphere that exists, and resistance creative activity, let's say. And women are very much part of it, women artists and women writers and so on. And what did you find any of this? Did you meet up with any of them when you traveled over there? And what are the sort of struggles that they have to face on the ground?
Actually, the civil society, as I said yesterday in Iran in general, and women and youth in particular, is absolutely fabulous what's going on in Iran. There is two parallel life, actually. There is the government, what they're doing. People doesn't want to know what they're doing. And people and civil society, they are fighting. And the resistance, cultural resistance in Iran, it's something absolutely fabulous. Not just writing, painting, graphic, movie, as you know, etc. But about writing, in fact, I wanted just to come in few words back about what we said about the Islamism and what she said in, I know quite well Turkey, I love Turkey by the way, secularism, why modernity didn't come in our country because of Islam, etc. I think we have to just emphasize one thing before going to the other point, which is when you don't have secularity, wheresoever you have the same problem. We had the same problem in Europe under the Inquisition. And again in South America and the new, how they call it, the new extremists of Judaism and Christianism, not Christianism, the new evangelists, thank you. It's exactly the same thing. Then we have not to point out Islam or the monotheist religion, all of them. For them, women are the half of a man. It's written in the law, and the law is that. Then what has happened to Iran, to come back to Iran, after being, in fact, pulled up to the modernity by the Pahlavis, that they have done a lot of the worst mistake they have done, they didn't understand that modernity is not just economic welfare. Modernity, it's a system of mind and it's a thinking. That's my father fought for modernity whole his life in Iran, and my grandfather, to make understand that we have to go with the world. And my grandfather used to take one surah of the Quran, go with your life. And the interpretation of Quran, for him, it was just three surah. The rest, he said, we have to make a reform of Islam. That is the real problem of Islam right now. Now coming back, what has happened to Iran? In fact, all of a sudden, women, they have been just no more rights, individual rights. And the mistake that Khomeini made, he didn't cut off with the political rights of women in Iran. Why? In the time of the Shah, he used to say prostitution comes because the Shah gave the political power to the woman, power to vote and power to be voted and power to be judged. Except the judgment, which is Islamic judgment, women, they were in the sphere of politics. That was his biggest mistake, because now his worst enemies of Islam is, they are some of the grandchildren, of this big boss. One of the greatest, actually, opponents of Khomeinism, it's his granddaughter. And I really have respect for her, because with her position, she had given interviews in New York Times, absolutely fabulous, saying this way, it's a prison. My grandfather didn't understand anything. I wanted to be a philosopher, and she said philosophy is not for women. Then when you see that, and secular women, now secular women and these women, we are getting together against the male domination. That is the problem. And the male domination comes through the so-called word of the God. And the cultural resistance of Iran comes from that. I mean, the granddaughter of Khomeini loves one of the greatest poets, modern poet of Iran, Forough Farrokhzad. She was the first one to talk about the body of a woman, the woman, of orgasm of a woman, and she was treated like a whore even under the Shah. That is what's going on in Iran. There is a lot of, I am sure, when there is a little bit of opening, I've seen some of the manuscripts in Iran under the table, as we say, fabulous. Painting, fabulous. The movie that they are, the script, they can't turn it right now, fabulous. And what the link now between, through internet, thanks to the internet, the link, I'm not very welcome in Iran, of course, even though I am going back. I'm a little bit, you know, what can I say, very...
Outspoken?
Yeah, let's say. Thank you. But I go back. I go back, exactly. I go back and I go under the beard telling them, this country belongs to us much more than all of you together. Because you harm this country, we are trying to serve this country. Thanks to the internet, my 12th Imam is a woman. It's written in French and it's the only book translated into English. It's a parody to say that if there is a Messiah, as you know in Shiism, we're waiting a Messi, the 12th Imam, 5 years old, he's still in a will. And this fool of Ahmadinejad, he made a mosque in Jamkaran. That is true. That is true happening today in Iran. And he says, that is the will. I mean, a guy said, I dreamt that the 12th Imam is in this will. And he made a shrine on this place, and people goes there, spend money, and I made a parody of that, saying, okay, there is a woman, a very young woman, the woman of this generation, 30 years old. She goes to Jamkaran. She doesn't believe in this nonsense. She has a father, a bit like my father, a very open man. And she goes there without telling their parents, because their parents doesn't want her to say, okay, I'm going to write a story. At least I'm going to send it in foreign country. And all of a sudden, she hear a voice. Hey, come on, I'm here. And a woman voice. In the beginning, she think it's a trick of the mullahs. And I've said, oh no, never. If it was a trick of the mullahs, it couldn't be a woman voice. And then after, all of a sudden, there is a 12th Imam there, and she said, I am coming because I am a grand child of Prophet Muhammad. I'm ashamed of what they are doing in his name. And I'm going to wipe up all of them. All of them.
Great. Fariba, thank
And
you.
as you said,
we have to stop.
I will finish it. I will finish it. You just cut off my tongue. Why you don't cut off the other tongue?
No. I'm not cutting off your tongue. I don't think I'm capable of cutting off your tongue.
No, if the mullahs, they can't. Certainly you can't.
Yes. True. And I wouldn't even try, but I think it's the clock that's cutting off. We don't have time for questions, right? No. Okay. I'm so sorry. And there would have been
That is
too many
William's fault.
questions.
He gave us just 1 hour.
Sorry?
He could have given us 3 hours.
What? One question. No, that's no point in a room full of so many people. One question. We can't have. So how much time do we have exactly? 5 minutes? 10. Okay. 10. All right.
Well,
so
I have a
now
you have
a
question.
choice. 10 minutes for. Sorry? Questions? You have a. Okay. The audience has decided.
India, the world's largest.
I was going to ask these
democracy.
women to speak about the veil, but we are not going to get there. Because it's one thing to look at the countries that they come from, but the countries they live in too, they have to look at. But anyway, we will not talk about that. Go ahead and ask your question. Just hold on, let the mic come. Okay, ask your question, I'll repeat it. Men mostly?
Men mostly are feminists like Jackson Cats.
Mostly.
Are you saying men are feminists?
Yes, mostly.
Men there are many feminists in the world.
Yes.
So my question is, why don't they support women in feminism?
Support.
I think that's a very good question. You should ask it to all the men in this audience.
Bravo!
No, thank you. That's really an excellent question. Thank you for asking it. Any other questions? Your last remark? Bejan wants to say something, please.
No, all this discussion remind me of Virginia Woolf's book called The Room of One's Own. She discussed during that book if Shakespeare had a sister who has same talent, would she ever become a Shakespeare or not? And at the end, she said no, because if Shakespeare's sister had same, talent and energy, she wouldn't have same freedom to go to leave this small country and go to London, or she didn't have same freedom or same power. I think talking about the new world, all this internet and other possibility for the writing and reaching the other worlds, it's opened another gate for the women, and there are enormous power of, all from poetry, from, novels. You see even in those countries, you can see the women writer and poet. In our country, I don't know if you have or not, there is a discussion, mainly men poet. They said, women cannot be a poet. My answer was, towards this discussion, why there was not women prophet. That's why you say that.
She's coming. She's coming.
Yeah, from Iran maybe. Yeah, women can have same, like, because women writing, it's more ground, it's more, when I see the subject of poetry, the symbol they use, it's more domestic, it's more connected to the race or the history of the family, history of the society or their family, and there is a very profound taste of poetry or writing, and I think this is very important to be supported and yeah.
Thank you. That's, I think, a great note on which to end this. Thank you, Shireen, Fariba, Nadifa, Bejan. Thank you to these wonderful women. Thank you all.